As I make these videos, I have to laugh because there are so many skills that birthing better fathers and mothers developed. It begins to feel like a plethora of skills because childbirth, even though it's a one-off experience, is so detailed. And it's detailed down to how women respond with each breath. And any of us who have been at births knows that. We can go from coping well and having that show up in how we breathe to feeling totally out of control within a nanosecond, and then having trouble getting back our control. Today I want to talk to you about what we've learned about having a progressive labor and what we learned about having a non-progressive labor. And this is called the 5 phases of contractions. All contractions have 5 phases. We just think of them as, oh God, another contraction's coming, or that wasn't a bad contraction, or that was such an intense contraction, or I had such crazy back labor during that contraction, or I have back labor between contractions. So we have a tendency to think of a contraction as a solid unit. But when we break it down into 5 phases, then several things happen. One is it's easier to cope with, and 2 is it's easier to understand whether our labor is progressing or not. We want to have a progressive labor. Progressive labor means that the contractions are going to change every hour or 2. At the present time, the way progressive labors are identified is through the dilation of the cervix. What we discovered as Birthing Better Families is that is not accurate because about 20 to 30% of all women have progressing labors but do not dilate until the very end of their labor. I'm one of them, so I know it exists. That means our contractions get longer, stronger, and closer together. And when we check ourselves, because we've done the internal work, we don't feel much change for many hours. And then we feel rapid change of what our cervix is doing. We discovered that paying attention to how the 5 phases of contractions are unfolding is a clearer understanding of what is happening inside our body. We all know that labor starts, so that's phase 1. Anybody who's been in labor knows that the sensations increase. That's phase 2. Then some of us experience a peak. That's the shortest phase, often the most intense. We're aware of it. And then the contractions begin to ease off. We're aware of that as well. And then they stop, and then there's a pause between contractions. That pause can vary. And that space in between is often used to determine when a woman should go to the hospital. And usually it's 3 minutes apart, with the contractions lasting a minute long, or maybe 5 minutes apart. And contractions can be incredibly regular in terms of their timing. However, they can be very irregular in terms of the sensations that we feel. And when we discovered and paid attention to the 5 phases of labor contractions, we used that information in many, many, many ways. We as women having the experience use that information and thus experiences of each contraction to modify, shift what skills we were using at any moment during those 5 phases. We did that primarily with our breath. We did that primarily with making certain that our body was open and soft inside for our baby's benefit. And we did that primarily with recognizing that our mind doesn't have to like one moment of it. We just have to keep going. For our partner, they are seeing and hearing those 5 phases. The start of a contraction is when a woman is doing the labor part. The pause in between is when she can rest. But we still use the skills during that period of time. So let me explain to you how we approach the 5 phases of contractions. When it starts, it's really important to put yourself in a position that you feel is both good for yourself and good for your baby's ability to open you up and eventually come down through and out your body. Why does this matter? Because during the pausing phase, it's very possible that we got into a resting position. And so we are moving out of a resting position into a working position. We are going to breathe through that period of time, and we will begin to feel that the intensity of the contraction begins to rise. As it rises, it is common that our breathing changes. When we have a peak, we are aware that the contraction has a type of intensity that most of us hope is not going to last forever. And usually as we're thinking that, we notice that the contraction is backing off, and little by little, the contraction eases off. It is the end of the contraction that Lamaze developed one of the great techniques that should be given to everyone, great skill, and that is the cleansing breath. It's letting go of all the work you've just done. And then it's important to get into a position where you can rest, fully rest, be very still. But being still in your body doesn't mean that your mind is empty. It means this is a very good time to go around the pelvic clock and soften inside your right hip, your pubic bone, your left hip, your pelvis, and all the little spaces in between. That's a good time to do that. When another contraction comes, we begin to feel it first. If we've slept between contractions, the person who is watching us first sees us have a movement, and that cues them to be ready to coach us. From the viewpoint of a coach, our job is to make certain that moment to moment, inhale and exhale, that the woman is coping, managing, working through, dealing with, handling, and staying in control of the changes that are going on inside her. And remember, all of this is taking place when there might be things happening to or around her, whether at a home birth or a hospital birth or a birth center birth. So as a coach, what we're doing is helping when she needs help, and we see that or hear that. We can see it by how a woman changes her face. She can go from looking very serene to suddenly wrinkling her brow. That will tell you. Or she'll go from being still to suddenly being very restless. And you can hear it in her voice. When you go through the 4 types of breathing and you come to the variation of in your nose and out your mouth and realize that within that one variation, there are lots of different ways that we breathe in our nose and out our mouth that range from to 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 So somewhere in there, you can hear a change from being in control to being out of control. So your job is to use the breathing pattern that helps her stay in control. And women will follow. They're looking for that. That's what they want a birth coach to be able to do. Not sit there and say to them, you're doing fine, you're doing fine. Women want to stay in control during labor contractions. Doing fine is not moaning and yelling. That's just getting through them. In that sense, yeah, you're doing fine. You got through that one. But the more that discomfort builds up as really unpleasant and out of control, the harder it is for women to gain their control back. So it's very important as a birth coach that you help right away. And then she will stay in control, and she will have unending gratitude to you in the birth and after the birth. Now, if you don't have a progressive labor with a good strong peak, your contractions are still going to start the same way, and they're still going to grow in intensity the same way. The difference is that they plateau. There's no defined peak that we inside ourselves feel is happening, that's too intense. It just plateaus. It stays the same. And then it eases off and goes away. When we have those kind of contractions for an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours or 15 hours, this is what is a non-progressive labor. Your baby is telling you something. What your baby is telling you is not opaque. It's telling you either that the position or the posture of your body is not giving it good alignment into the inlet and mid-pelvis, or that you have tension somewhere inside your body. It can be inside the pelvic bones so that it is hard for the uterus to retract the top of the vagina back into those bones, or it can be in the articulations of the bones itself, which prevent the baby from opening up the pelvis and moving down into the inlet of the birth canal. Or there can be tension inside the top of the birth canal. And when I say that, you're going to go, where's that? Okay, tense up the inside of your sacrum, tense up inside of your lower belly, tense up inside where your leg bones meet your hips. That's where the top of the birth canal is. And when women have tension there, their sacrums are immobile, and it prevents the baby from moving down further and pushing the sacrum out and back. And it prevents the uterus from retracting the top of the vagina and dilating cervix all the way into the bones of your hip blades, your mid-sacrum, and your mid-pubic bone. Now just relax in those areas, soften in those areas, be specific as where you feel the tension, soften and let go of that tension. And as you breathe in, expand in those areas where you had tension. And when you breathe out, just soften in those areas again. For a birth coach, it's recognizing whether there is change in the labor contractions every hour or two. Women will know that. They'll tell you, oh, that was a good one. Oh, the contractions are getting more intense now. Or the women say, I feel like I've been doing this for hours, or I don't feel there's any change. So we want to use the 5 phases of contraction like a book. We want to read the labor. When we read the labor, we're more likely to know when and which skills best suit what the action is that's happening at that particular time. For instance, if you've learned the hip lift, and let's say you didn't feel incredibly mobile in that, but you sort of ignored figuring out where the tensions were inside, and your labor seems to stall. And you think to yourself, I wonder if the hip lift will work, because you have a cheat sheet of all the skills with you. And you ask your partner to do the hip lift on you. They can feel how much tension you have when they do it. And your body is very sensitive to the hormones in birth at this point. And remember, we talked about tension and how much space a baby needs. A baby is stuck when this happens, can't move. And all you have to do is soften, soften, soften until this happens. That's enough for the baby to move. And you become more motivated when you're in labor, particularly if you feel the contractions are not progressing. One thing that's very important when you do the hip lift in labor is after you've done it, you absolutely must get into a gravity plus position. And you must have the bones you sit on open. You must have the top of your body aligned to the inlet of the pelvis. And you must wait at least 3 contractions to let your baby deal with the changes that you have created inside your body. What are the changes to expect? If you have gone from this to that, you would expect the 3 contractions to begin to indicate that the baby is no longer stuck and the contraction becomes more effective. It has that peak. And sometimes you can be very surprised. You can go from a stalled labor to a very progressive labor very rapidly. You have to be prepared for that. And your birth coach has to be prepared to help you cope with that. So this is a short lesson on the 5 phases of contractions.